much. Standing here at this point actually reminds me of a very seminal event in my life. I reached a point, thank God, where I was conducting a Seder and my first grandchild was old enough to be at the Seder. And so this is great. It's a wonderful experience. So many of you have had the experience passing the Masorah on to the next generation. So I break the matzah and I turn to him and I say, Shmu, which is his nickname. I say, Shmu, you know why we eat matzah? Because the Jews were rushing out of Egypt and they didn't have time to make bread. And he looks at me and says, I know that already. So then I take out the maror and I show him the way. So you know why we eat maror? Because everything was so bitter and all that. And he rolls his eyes and he said, I know that already. Well, hardly 5 minutes passed. I was discussing a machlokas between Rab Kiva Egan and Mukha Yosef about some detail in the carbon pest, trying to find something the kid didn't know already. After these two speeches that you've heard already, I expect that anything I'm going to say, you're going to stand here and say, I know that already. So I'll try to just embellish upon what has been said, but most has been said already. First of all, let me start with the thank yous. Thank Moshe Hanun and Rainu for all the work that they've done. From the OHEL end in the back of the room, I want to thank Tzivi Ryder, who really organized it from our end. And also thank David Mendel and the entire OHEL board, who makes it possible for us to do the work. I think OHEL is one of the best kept secrets in New York, the scope of the services that they provide. I know when I joined them 5 years ago, I didn't even know myself how much they've done. But let me start with one story, and I think that'll help shape the piece that I want to focus on, which was a defining moment in my development as a clinician. And it goes back many more years than I care to think. I was graduating YU in 1974, and at that time, just about everybody from YU was either going into law or medicine. And I was going into psychology. I was an upper senior, and I had the very special zchus of spending 3 years in the shiur of Rav Aaron Kreiser, Zichrono Livracha. And those, many of you may know who Rav Kreiser was and what he represented. Really an astounding Talmid Chacham from the Altamir that went through Shanghai. And I was an upper senior. I was accepted into my first choice as a graduate program. I had 1.5 feet out the door, and he was giving me some very well-deserved musar. And at one point he said in the middle, he said, you're going to medical school, right? And I said, no. He said, going to law school? And I said, no. So what are you doing? I said, psychology. He said, psychology. And he took me outside, and he put me up against the wall, and with his finger in my face, he said to me, Blumenthal, you want to be a psychologist, you got to be a gaon. You got to be a genius. So a doctor, a lung is a lung, but every patient who comes into your office is a parsha b'fnei atzma, is a unique person. And then he said, so listen to your professors, read the books, and study hard, because it's not an easy profession. As was mentioned, I'm over 40 years in the field, and every time I get a new patient, I see Roy Kreiser in front of me. And I say to myself, Blumenthal, doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, how much you lecture, how much you published, you're now starting from scratch. You've heard some wonderful descriptions, and certainly the cutting-edge work in anxiety. The problem, I think, is that we can't just look at it as cookie cutters. Each person is unique. And it was mentioned earlier in the beautiful introductory speech that this treatment is unique in that it's a collaborative treatment. You don't anesthetize patients and cut the anxiety out of them. You work with them, and every person is unique. Now, there's no question that exposure therapy and behavioral treatment is the treatment of choice, the primary treatment for anxiety, and certainly our staff in the OHEL clinics have been trained in evidence-based treatments, including treatments for family, et cetera, and are constantly being updated and retrained. And the reason for that is very simple. As was mentioned earlier, fear is good, and fear is essential for survival. But for that reason, fear can get very easily disconnected from the cause of the fear, or the original reason for the fear, because you need fear. So I can give you a very simple example. Those of us who are parents, and it's probably experience we've all had, that one time when our toddler started to run out into the street or did something comparably scary, we scared the living daylights out of them. And they have it in their psyche, so they won't do that again. And it's not because it's connected to, oh my God, my father or my mother got so angry. It's because it's now taken on a life of its own. Now that's good, that's adaptive. But when a fear is generated, as mentioned, that is not warranted by the reality of the world out there or by what's happening, therefore morphs into an anxiety disorder, sometimes the original cause or the original reason why it became a source of anxiety is no longer relevant. It takes on a life of its own. And therefore the treatment has to be very much a symptom treatment, has to be that re-exposure. The other reason is that when you're afraid of something, you avoid it. So therefore, you have to face it in order. That's the paradox of treatment for anxiety. But there are other treatments, some of which are sometimes more indicated or certainly maybe an adjunct to the actual treatment, the exposure treatment, the behavioral treatment for therapy that deserves its focus as well. And I think since the other types of treatment have been so exhaustively focused on, I want to focus on some of those alternative approaches and what people can do for family members who have anxiety. As I mentioned at OHEL, we have a program that's called the SPACE program. It was developed in Yale, which is to help families who have a loved one, a member of the family, who is suffering from anxiety. So first of all, let me say a little bit about medication. Medication can be mistreated. Medication also for most psychiatric conditions is not a cure. But for that matter, as our medical student can probably attest to, medication in most medical disorders is not a cure. Yes, antibiotics will cure infections. But most conditions that we treat with medication treat the symptoms or try to alleviate the symptoms is not necessarily a cure for the illness. And sometimes people are so overwrought with anxiety that they need, and medication works quickly, and that they may need medication to stabilize them. Sometimes they're too anxious to even benefit from the treatments. And therefore, properly prescribed, and the good psychiatrists prescribe it properly, but properly prescribed medication so that the anxiety can be not eliminated, but reduced enough so that the treatment can be employed is essential. So again, it's a judgment call, and sometimes medication is used, and psychiatric medication, just like psychiatric illness, is no different than medication for other medical ailments, and there should be no shame associated with it. I will tell you, and I'll talk a little bit later whether we cure anxiety or do we master it. That's, I think, a very important point. But I know people who have been treated for anxiety disorders, but will walk around with either Xanax or Klonopin or something in their pocketbook or in their briefcase, and if they're in a situation, they're not taking it regularly, but if they have to make a very important presentation, or they're facing a very difficult situation, that they'll take it just to take the edge off of the anxiety so they can manage it. And again, if you don't take medication if you don't take medication for asthma, if you don't take medication for migraine headaches, if you're a naturalist, et cetera, then fine, then don't take that medication. But it should be no different than how medication is used in general medical ailments. Let me talk a little bit also about old-fashioned psychodynamic psychotherapy. I know I'm a dinosaur, but you know, I know I learned it when I was in graduate school during the Civil War, so it was a little difficult at the time, but it has its place, sometimes as an adjunct, sometimes as the treatment of choice. There are certain people who need to understand themselves. There are certain people for whom that is a master, or they need to understand where this irrational fear came from. And obviously in conjunction with exposure. And sometimes exposure can be done in conjunction with that treatment, but that is helpful to them. I think it's always safest to share personal experiences. I don't have to worry about, you know, HIPAA laws and exposing something from the treatment that we do. But I will tell you personally that at a certain juncture in my life, becoming aware of being a child of Holocaust survivor and how that contributed to certain impediments and anxieties that governed my life, that I acquired in a therapeutic, in the context of psychotherapy, not only helped me overcome those hurdles, but has enriched my life immensely, that now I look at it as an asset and as a contribution to my success. I couldn't have done this if I didn't reach that understanding, if I didn't work on it and relive some of those childhood experiences and redefine aspects of my life in the context of knowing about Auschwitz and not being able to talk about it as a child. Now, if somebody had just come to me at that time, which was around the time I was in college, and say, listen, Blumenthal, you know, you're nuts because your mother's a Holocaust, went through 7 concentration camps, and here I'll explain it all to you, it would have been very interesting intellectually, it wouldn't have been very useful. But letting it evolve gradually and letting it coming to understand it, and then redefine it in terms of other aspects of my life has been an enriching experience and still has a role and still has a place in the treatment of anxiety. Now, let me give you a mashal that I give to the rabbinic students. Dave Pelkovitz and I co-teach the smicha students at YU, and we teach a pastoral psych course. And then when we talk about anxiety, we talk about OCD. Well, we have a fascinating class in differentiating between OCD and Frumkeit. It's very interesting. We have a lot of fun with that. By the way, one thing I do have to say, and I don't like to, I'm not aware of OCD being an Ashkenazi disease. Oh, okay, you just threw that in because you're a Sfardi yourself. Okay, but in fact, the interesting thing about OCD is that the studies show that its frequency in let's not just Orthodox, in a fundamentalist religious community is the same as the general population, but it takes on religious themes. In other words, it's the garb, it's not the presence. But, and actually we have one of my smicha students here, so I can't lie about what I do, but what we try to do is, I give the following example. Again, imagine somebody has heart disease, Rahman al-Islam. Okay, and the heart disease is being caused by a blocked aorta or some sort of arrhythmia or something like that. That needs to be treated medically. That needs to be treated professionally. But once that treatment has been implemented, there are many lifestyle changes that you can make that will ensure your health or cardiac health. So going to the health club, you know, leaving out the Kishkan Shabbos, or what is that thing called, Yupcha? I just look at it and I get, I get arrhythmia. But, you know, you know, there's lifestyle change, maybe less stress in your life. So there's a lot that you can do that's not formal treatment, but that can be an antidote to anxiety. And for some instances, it's a very interesting thing that's happening in the world today. Both Rabbanim and teachers are becoming sort of pseudo-therapists. So not for necessarily a full-fledged anxiety disorder, but for students or congregants who have high levels of anxiety but not yet a disorder, a lot of that intervention is being done by the teachers and the rabbis. For example, we have a program in OHEL where we go into middle schools. We're expanding. We did it this past year in a school in Long Island. I was part of that program as well, where we were training teachers to help students with anxiety. Part of the reason for that is, interestingly enough, is the role of the teacher is changing completely, because the teacher as the purveyor of information is not necessary anymore. A kid can click a mouse and find out anything. So teachers' roles are really changing along with technology, and they're becoming much more, their role is much more to put the information in meaningful context, but they're also becoming sort of pseudo-therapists to address the emotional needs and the high levels, as mentioned earlier, the exponential growth of anxiety among both adults and children, to address it somewhat. But as I said, so there's a lot that they can do. So when we talk about, we talk about reading the Chovas Halvavos and learning. If I'm speaking, let's say, to Lamudei Kodesh teachers or to Rabbanim, that's important for recovery from anxiety disorder. That's an important way to reduce anxiety. But there are many other kind of things you do. First of all, if you have a family member who has anxiety, don't poo-poo it and don't downplay it. It's real and it's painful. So validate it. You may not be giving into it, and you may have to sort of avoid sort of accommodating it, but treat it as real because it is real. Don't ever discount or invalidate those kind of emotions or feelings. And very few people, unless it's the night before a big exam, are going to present to you that, oh, I have so much anxiety. But they're going to, it's when they're presenting it, they mean it. But other kind of things, outlets are so important. And that's, by the way, where in our community that becomes very important, because our day is so jam-packed. Our day for our children is so jam-packed that sometimes we're remiss. When sometimes I'll have, let's say, a high school student come to me, a yeshiva high school student come to me for anxiety, I'll just ask him, do you get to play ball? And he'll say, yeah, Friday afternoon. In today's world, not only because of anxiety, But because of the kind of restraint we expect from such boys, they should be playing ball several times a day. There's no excuse today for yeshiva not to have a ball field, a gym, or let these exercise. It's such an anxiety release. After you do exercise, you feel calmer. That's very important. Yeah, right. And especially the Red Sox need it pretty badly lately. No, okay, but they're for once the Yankees are ahead of them, you know. But anyway, and maybe sports is not for everybody, or exercise is not for everybody. But again, if somebody has anxiety, it's all the more so. But whether it's art, it's music, and by the way, learning. All these kind of, if it works for that person, or reading, or literature, different types of activities, especially when there's a lot of anxiety. And the interesting thing is, again, because especially in yeshiva today, and especially because our days are so jam-packed, even outside of yeshiva, the notion of a 9-to-5 job doesn't exist anymore. We carry our work and all our responsibilities with us in this little holster with the phone. So we literally have to carve out time. And by the way, no less important, and I know this has been emphasized so but it bears repeating, time with family together, spend time together with your spouses. Families that eat dinner together, the research is overwhelming, have practically zero instances of substance abuse. The reading scores of children of families who eat dinner together is higher than the reading scores of those who do not eat dinner together. You have to carve out time, family time, to be together, to talk. You don't have to do anything extraordinary. You don't have to do exposure therapy with them. But just spending time, quality time with each other and with children. And we have to, today, we can't just take it for granted. The office doesn't close at 5 o'clock. We have to create those opportunities to have time together, even vacations. It's great to go to amusement parks, etc., or Shabbos for that matter. You know, I don't know how it is here in Crown Heights, but in other neighborhoods it becomes a compulsion that you have to have guests over. And so what happens is you sit with the guests, the kids eat in the kitchen, they run outside and play, you spend no time with the children. Very important. And that is an anxiety reducer that helps. That helps in terms of treatment of anxiety. We have to destigmatize, has been emphasized, mental illness. I often say, just as an example, somebody makes a Misha Berach for somebody. It's a Misha Berach for Chola. So afterwards, you go, well, who are you making Misha Berach for? So you'll say, oh, you know, my father was diagnosed with heart disease. My husband, my wife, diagnosed with, you know, asthma, or something. My child has, you know, had a fracture. Why can't you say, you know what, my kid has anxiety, or my spouse has been diagnosed with OCD? It's no different. Why should it be any difference? And the more we can normalize and destigmatize mental illness, the more people will go for help, and the more we can discuss it and make it a topic of conversation. Now, thank you. Okay. I should run for office. This is great. You know. Okay. Who wants to run for office nowadays? Anyway, one more thing. This is a question that whenever I speak at these kind of community forums, almost always comes up, which is, afterwards I'll say, that was great, it was so interesting, but let's say a principal comes and says, Dr. Blumenthal, I'm all with you and we'll make referrals. It costs a lot of money. Right? We know the famous line, right? It's, you know, this is, you know, it costs a lot of money. And I can work with somebody, I can go, or I want to go for therapy. I mean, I often tell my patients, I couldn't afford myself. You know, it's, it is expensive. So let me talk, I want to address that a little bit because I think it's an important consideration. And I'll tell you something else also. If, let's say, somebody will come to me and say, I really can't afford it. All right, but you know what? I'll only eat bread and water, and I'll, you know, and I'll sell 3 of my children into servitude, you know, and I'll do something, and I'll scrounge together the money, and I'll just about make it work. You can't benefit. Again, therapy is a collaborative effort, and if it's so much stress, I have the same thing. If somebody calls from Muncie or from Lakewood, they want to come see me once. If they come for a one-time consult, that's one thing. They can come once a week. It's 2 hours, it's 4 hours in the car. That's fine. You know, if you can do that every week, it's going to be such an imposition. And now we have Skype and Zoom and all that, but it's going to be such an imposition. You're not going to benefit from the treatment. So what do we do about this? And again, on the other hand, though, therapists can't be therapists if they can't charge for their services. It was a point in my life when I was working for OHEL, I was working for YU, I was working for Northwell, and I had private practice, and people would say to me, you have 4 jobs. And I said, yeah, 1 for each tuition. How can we, so what can we do about that? So first of all, if you can afford it, it's money well spent. I've had patients tell me they made money on therapy because they're functioning better, so they're doing better in their job. But there's a few things. First of all of us, clinicians, I say all, many of us do see patients at low cost. There's a master zmanim, we do dedicate a certain amount of time. I will tell you personally, and I think that's important consideration, nothing gets my Irish up more than if there's, let's say, a physician or a rabbi in our community who sends his regular, his paying patients to somebody else, which is fine. There are a lot of very good clinicians and facilities. And then when he has a low-cost one, he calls me. That I'm not going to. I remember there was one Rav who used to do it regularly, and I once saw him and I said, Rabbi, I'm not that person. But we all take some. So that's one consideration. There's group therapy, which is a very effective treatment. Also, we are streamlining treatment. We're working, it's just the whole complexion of mental health has changed. And we're looking and working to develop ways where either treatment is much quicker or doesn't require weekly sessions. We're all aware of this. And especially now with very little and inadequate insurance reimbursement. So it's something that we're aware of and we're working on. But there are also clinics and facilities that offer provisions or services that take insurance or work on a sliding scale. OHEL has 2 such clinics, one in Flatbush and one in Far Rockaway. And granted, the clinicians for the most part are younger and less experienced, although there's some that are more experienced. But it's far from clear whether young new therapists are any less successful than some of the more seasoned people. There's some data that suggests that they compensate in effort for what is maybe lacking in experience. So you can get some very good treatment there, and I can tell you certainly that I'm speaking for OHEL, but I'm sure it's true of Jewish Family Services and the other facilities, our staff. I don't think there's any profession where people so constantly and regularly try to update their skills as mental health professionals do. So that's another option, and there should be and there can be gemachs to help pay for the treatment. These are all should be considerations, but it's a real problem. And I think we have to be aware of it, and we have to brainstorm and figure out ways. But as I said, there are those options. And certainly in the back, you see there are many wonderful organizations being featured. Make it a point to come back there, find out what services they have to offer. I'm familiar with just about every one of them, and they're well worth knowing about. And now one more last question, and I'll address that. Do we really cure anxiety? Or do we teach people to manage it? Do we teach people to use it to their benefit? And again, I think what I'm going to say is going to pale in comparison to what was described earlier in terms of how in his case, OCD was used as something constructive. But there's a very thin line between what we consider psychiatric disorders and healthy functioning. There's a very thin line between depression and interpersonal sensitivity. There's a very thin line between paranoia and being a good chess player or being a good lawyer or being a good army general because you're thinking so much about what the other person's doing. There's a very thin line between anxiety and ambition. And most people who are very successful will tell you that they are beset by anxiety, but they've triumphed over the anxiety and they use it constructively. And therefore, some of our most successful people are anxious people, but instead of the anxiety governing them, they rule over the anxiety. And that's to a large extent what we really do when we do these techniques. I often tell my patients, I'm not going to change you, I'm going to make you better at who you are. And that's what we do. And in that spirit, I just want to end with a very beautiful insight that I read from Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, who in this community is somebody should be well known, both because of his connection with the Rebbe and also his having grown up in a community of Chabad where he has very fond memories from his childhood. But in the book Ala Tshuva, which is a collection of his tshuva speeches that he gave at RCA, he mentioned the following, that a psychiatrist once said to him that if he could change one part of our tefillah, or one part of our davening, he would take out uvechein tein pachtecha, in the davening of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that we should have fear, that you should give us fear. Because he said anxiety is so much at the root of so many personal problems that he would, if he had the authority to do so, he would take out those words of v'chein tein pachtecha. So Rabbi Soloveitchik's response is, at first he said, I'm not a psychiatrist, but he thinks it's just the opposite. Because there is one fear, there is one anxiety, that if you have it, as we mentioned earlier, it alleviates a lot of the other anxieties. And that's the anxiety and the fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That if you have the Yiras Shamayim, if you have that kind of fear, then all other fears become less important. If you believe that there is a greater control, that there is one person at the helm, and that whatever happens, it's happening for some good desired purpose, then all other fears kind of get alleviated or fall by the wayside. So it says, please, if you're going to give me anxiety, that's the anxiety you should give me. Thank you, and I think we have now someone. Okay.